You ever have one of those moments where you're just standing on your own property, minding your own business, and suddenly you're the star of a one-act play you never auditioned for? That was my life. I had a front row seat to the craziest show on earth, and the lead actress? A woman who called the cops on me for trespassing, completely oblivious to the fact that her name was on a lease agreement that landed on my desk every single month. She had absolutely no clue that the very HOA rules she was screaming about were being broken in a house that I owned. This story gets wild, folks. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, because you are not going to want to miss a single second of this insanity. So, let me set the stage for you. My name's Frank, I'm 62, and a few years ago, I decided to hang up my hard hat. I spent 40 years as a land surveyor and civil engineer. You know, the guy who tells people exactly where their property ends and their neighbor's drama begins. It's a job that teaches you a couple of things: patience, precision, and the fact that most arguments can be solved with a good map and a clear title. I thought I'd seen it all. I've seen fistfights over a misplaced fence post and family feuds over a 3-foot strip of crabgrass. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for Brenda. Or as the neighborhood came to know her, Karen, the self-appointed queen of Shady Lake. I'd sunk my retirement into a nice little portfolio of properties, including a small cluster of 4 houses and a vacant lot on this beautiful, quiet lake. The crown jewel was my own place, right on the water. The other 3 houses were rentals, managed by a property company, so I wouldn't have to deal with the day-to-day headaches. It was my nest egg, my peace and quiet. The plan was simple: enjoy my coffee on the dock, do a little fishing, and watch the value of my investment grow. For the first year, it was bliss. Absolute paradise. Then, Brenda moved in. It was back in what I called a year of the title transfer 2019, when the previous tenants in the blue house next to me moved out and she moved in. At first, she seemed fine. A bit intense, maybe. The 53-year-old woman had a haircut you could set your watch to, and a way of looking at your lawn that made the grass feel self-conscious. She was the kind of person who'd bring you a welcome to the neighborhood casserole, but she'd probably include a laminated card with the calorie count and a suggestion for a better brand of bakeware. Dude, the warning signs were there, but I'm a live and let live kind of guy. I figured, hey, it takes all sorts. I had no idea I was living next door to a wannabe dictator. The trouble started small. A polite note taped to my door. 7:14 a.m. one Monday morning. Dear neighbor, it began, in a font that was somehow both cursive and condescending. I noticed your recycling bin was placed more than 3 inches from the curb. For a cohesive community aesthetic, please adhere to the Shady Lake HOA guidelines. I just blinked at it. Shady Lake HOA? I'd owned this land for years. There was no HOA, there was an old, defunct lake association from the 80s that existed only on a single piece of paper in the county records office. The year of the original deed, 1988 to be exact, but it had no power, no members, no nothing. I crumpled up the note and tossed it. A week later, another one. This time, about the color of the flowers I'd planted. Apparently, my choice of marigolds was visually disruptive. This was Brenda's opening salvo in a war one didn't even know I was supposed to be fighting. She'd formed her own little homeowners association with the tenants of the other 2 rental properties I owned. 3 households. That was it. She'd crowned herself president, naturally, and had written a binder of bylaws thicker than my first mortgage paperwork. The other 2 families, nice people just trying to live their lives, were basically hostages. They went along with it because it was easier than fighting her. George, the guy in the house on the other side of her, would catch me by the mailbox. He'd look around like he was passing state secrets and whisper, "Just ignore her, Frank. She gets an idea in her head, and that's it." Man, it was shocking how much power she thought she had. She was building an empire on land that wasn't even hers. And the crazy part is, she had no idea that the king she was trying to overthrow was the one cashing her rent checks. I decided to just lay low. Keep to myself. Surely, this little Napoleon complex would burn itself out, right? Oh, how wrong I was. This wasn't just a phase. This was her destiny. Karen, She must have been destined to have that name, even if her driver's license said Brenda. The notes on my door became a regular feature of my mornings. They were like a terrible, unsolicited newspaper subscription. On a Thursday at 8:34 a.m., I received a formal-looking letter, complete with a letterhead she'd clearly designed herself, a comb, clip-art picture of a duck, and the words, Shady Lake Homeowners Association, preserving excellence. This wasn't a suggestion. It was an invoice, a $100 lake maintenance fee. I almost choked on my coffee. She was charging me a fee to maintain the lake access path and the community dock. The path and the dock that were, located entirely on my private property. I'd had them built myself back in the year of the building permit 2018. Wow, this woman is unbelievable. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. I decided it was time for a friendly, neighborly chat. A little clarification was in order. I walked over that afternoon, map in hand, a professionally drawn plat map from my surveying days. I found her in her yard, meticulously measuring the distance between her rosebush with a tape measure. I gave her my best friendly old guy smile. Brenda, I started. Got your notice. I think there might be a little misunderstanding about the property lines. I unrolled the map. You see, this entire path, right up to the water, and the land the dock is on, it's all part of my parcel. I pointed to the thick, clear line that separated my lot from the rental properties. Her eyes glazed over for a second, as if I'd started speaking in ancient Greek. Then she gave this tight little laugh. "Oh, Frank," she said, patting my arm in a way that was meant to be reassuring, but felt more like she was checking for structural weaknesses. "That's very sweet, but this is an HOA matter. We are the governing body for the community. Your little maps are, well, they're quaint, but they don't supersede our bylaws." Quaint. She called my legally binding county-recorded plat map quaint. That's when I knew this wasn't about a misunderstanding. This was about power. She didn't care about facts or deeds or laws. She had her binder, and in her mind, that binder was the supreme law of the land. From that day on, things escalated. She saw my refusal to pay her imaginary fee as a declaration of war. My quiet retirement was turning into a low-grade suburban conflict zone. She'd stand on her porch and just stare at me when I was in my yard. One Tuesday, at 10:57 a.m., I looked out my window and she was taking pictures of my canoe, which I'd left on the grass next to my house. A few hours later, a new notice was taped to my door. This one was a violation. Apparently, I had an unapproved watercraft stored in a non-designated area. It came with a $50 fine. This fine, of course, was from the year of the first fine 2022, a document with as much legal standing as a grocery list. I started a new file folder. I labeled it Brenda's Fan Fiction and put all her notices and fines in it. Her campaign of petty tyranny ramped up. She started holding official HOA meetings on my dock. I'd be sitting in my living room, and suddenly, there'd be Brenda and the two other tenant families, all sitting in a circle on my property while she pontificated about the importance of beige mailbox posts. George would always catch my eye and give me this little apologetic shrug. I could hear her droning on about new regulations. Effective immediately, she announced one evening, lake access hours will be from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. to minimize residential disturbance. She was setting a curfew for me to use my own dock. Dude, it was surreal. It was like watching a performance artist, but the art was just pure, unadulterated entitlement. The other neighbors were caught in the crossfire. The wife from the third house, a sweet young woman named Maria, came over one afternoon, close to tears. She told me Brenda had fined her $25 because her kid's tricycle was visible from the street for more than an hour. "We just pay it," she said, her voice a whisper. "It's not worth the fight." She'd just find something else to complain about, and that's how she operated. She was a bully who thrived on intimidation and the reluctance of good people to cause a scene. She was weaponizing their desire for a peaceful life against them. My patience, which I once thought was nearly infinite, was starting to wear thin. The surveyor in me wanted to pound stakes with bright orange flags every 10 feet along the property line. The engineer in me wanted to build a 10-foot-high fence. But the 62-year-old retiree just wanted to be left alone. I decided to continue my strategy of passive resistance. I ignored the fines. I ignored the meeting minutes she started leaving on my doorstep, and I used my dock whenever I damn well pleased. I thought, eventually, she'd run out of steam. I underestimated her. I gravely underestimated the bottomless well of righteous indignation that fuels a person like Brenda. The tipping point, the moment this whole Cold War went hot, happened on a Saturday. A perfect, glorious Saturday morning in late spring. It was about 9:37 a.m. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and I was exactly where I wanted to be, sitting on my dock in my favorite old lawn chair with a steaming mug of coffee and a fishing line in the water. It was the epitome of the peaceful retirement I had worked my whole life for. And then I heard it. That sharp nasal voice cutting through the tranquility like a rusty saw. Excuse me. Excuse me. I didn't even have to look. It was Brenda, standing at the edge of the path, hands on her hips, clad in a pastel-colored tracksuit that screamed, "I'm not angry. I'm just enforcing community standards for your own good." I didn't say anything. I just took a slow sip of my coffee and pretended to be intensely interested in my fishing boater. "This is a restricted area until 10 a.m. on weekends," she yelled. "You are in direct violation of HOA Bylaw 7.4, subsection B." I sighed, finally turning to look at her. "Brenda," I said, as calmly as I could, "good morning. As we've discussed, your bylaws don't apply to me or my property." She took a step onto the path, her face turning a shade of magenta that clashed horribly with her tracksuit. "This isn't your property," she shrieked. "It's a community asset, and you have been repeatedly warned. I have documented every single one of your violations." She was holding her phone up, probably recording. "I am giving you one last chance to comply and remove yourself from the premises." I just chuckled. I couldn't help it. The sheer absurdity of it all. "Well, what, Brenda? You're going to issue me another one of your fake fines?" That was it. That was the spark that lit the fuse. Her eyes narrowed. "You think this is a joke?" she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I am the president of this association, and I will not have our rules flouted. You've left me no choice." She turned her back to me, held her phone to her ear, and I heard the words that changed everything. "Yes, I'd like to report a trespasser." Man, it was shocking. I couldn't believe it. I just sat there in my lawn chair, fishing rod in hand, as she dictated my description to the 911 operator. Yes, an older man, gray hair, seems confused. He's become belligerent and is refusing to leave our community dock. Belligerent? Confused? I hadn't even raised my voice. She was painting a picture of some senile old coot who'd wandered onto her pristine property. Wow, this officer is going to be so confused, I thought. And about 10 minutes later, he was. A police cruiser pulled up quietly, and a young officer, looked like he was barely out of his 20s, got out. He had that cautious but tired look that cops get when they know they're walking into a classic neighborhood dispute. Brenda practically ran to him, launching into her dramatic, prepared speech. She was pointing at me, gesticulating wildly, a binder of her precious bylaws now magically in her hand. "Thank you for coming so quickly, officer," she said breathlessly. "This man has been a recurring problem. He refuses to join the HOA and continually trespasses on our private property." The officer listened patiently, nodding, and then he walked down the path toward me. I hadn't moved an inch. I just reeled in my line and set the rod down. "Morning, officer," I said, staying seated. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" He gave me a small, professional smile. "Sir, I'm Officer Miller. I've had a report of you trespassing here. This lady says this is private HOA property." I nodded slowly. "Well, she's half right," I said. "It is private property. It's mine." I pulled out my wallet, not for my ID, but for a laminated card I'd had made for just such an occasion. It was a condensed version of the property plat, showing my parcel in bright yellow. I also pulled up the county assessor's website on my phone, showing the owner of Lot 12, Block 4, as my LLC. "As you can see," I said, handing him the phone, "I own this lot, which includes this path and the dock. She, on the other hand, is a tenant in that blue house over there." The officer took the phone and studied it. His eyebrows went up. He walked a few feet away, typed something into the computer in his car, and then walked back. He handed me my phone. He then turned to Brenda, who was watching us, tapping her foot impatiently. "Ma'am," the officer said, his tone shifting from inquisitive to weary. "This gentleman does, in fact, own this property. He's not trespassing. He has every right to be here." Dude, the look on Brenda's face. It was a cinematic masterpiece of disbelief, rage, and sputtering indignation. It was like her entire world, a world held together by Word documents and a laminator, had just been declared a fiction. But our bylaws," she stammered, waving her binder like a talisman against reason. "He has to join the HOA. It's mandatory for all residents of Shady Lake," the officer sighed. "Ma'am, an HOA is a civil agreement. You can't force a property owner to join if their deed doesn't include that covenant. And even if it did, this is a civil matter, not a police matter. You can't call 911 to enforce your HOA rules." He then looked at her sternly. "And you definitely cannot call us to have a man removed from his own property. Misusing the 911 system is a serious offense." She was deflated. Utterly, completely defeated. For a moment. Then the rage returned, a tidal wave of it. She turned her glare on me. "This isn't over," she hissed. "I'll be speaking to my lawyer. We'll sue you. We'll take this dock for the community." She then stormed back to her house and slammed the door. The young officer just shook his head and looked at me. "Sorry you had to deal with that, sir. Some people, huh?" I just smiled. "Comes with the territory, officer. Thanks for being so professional." He tipped his hat and left. The whole encounter was a public humiliation for her. She had tried to use the law as her personal cudgel, and it had been turned back on her in front of the very person she was trying to intimidate. And that's when I knew my passive approach had to end. She had crossed a line. She had tried to use the power of the state to harass me, to potentially have me arrested on my own land. The game had changed. No more ignoring her. No more chuckling at her silly notices. The surveyor, the engineer, the meticulous planner who had been dormant inside me, woke up. It was time to stop defending my property and start dismantling her entire sham empire. I went inside, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, and sat down at my computer. I started by pulling up every document I had, the original deed 1988, the title transfer 2015 to my LLC, all the permit 2019 filings for the dock construction. I was going to build a case so solid, so airtight that her binder of bylaws would look like the scrap paper it was. My quiet retirement was officially over. It was time to go to work. My first call on Monday morning was to my lawyer, a sharp guy named David, who had handled all my property acquisitions. I wasn't looking to sue. That's not my style. I wanted to end this, not escalate it into a years-long court battle. I explained the entire situation, from the first note about the recycling bin to the 911 call. David listened patiently, and I could almost hear him smiling through the phone. "Frank," he said when I was done, This is beautiful. It's a classic case of overreach from a completely illegitimate entity." He confirmed my suspicion. The old lake association from the 80s had been dissolved by the state for inactivity decades ago. Brenda's HOA had as much legal authority as a book club. But then David asked the question that set the entire plan in motion. "You said she rents, right? From your LLC through that property management company?" "That's right," I said. "David," he said, a real excitement in his voice now, "forget the HOA. That's a symptom, not the disease. The lease agreement. That's your leverage. That's your power. Get me a copy of her signed lease agreement. Right now." I thanked him, hung up, and immediately called the property management company. 20 minutes later, the PDF was in my inbox. The lease 2020. I opened it and started reading. And oh man, it was better than I could have imagined. It was a standard ironclad lease. And Brenda, in her haste to become the queen of our little corner of the world, had violated it in about a dozen different ways. There was a clause about quiet enjoyment, prohibiting any tenant from harassing or disturbing their neighbors. Well, calling the cops on your neighbor who also happens to be your landlord seemed like a pretty clear violation of that. There was another clause prohibiting any business from being run out of the residence without written consent. I'd argue that collecting fraudulent dues and issuing fines for a sham HOA was in fact an unregistered, unauthorized business. Every violation notice she had taped to my door, every meeting she held on my dock, was a nail she was hammering into her own coffin. My strategy was no longer just about defending my own property lines. It was about a total, systematic takedown, a full-scale counteroffensive. I spent the next 2 weeks in what I called reconnaissance mode. I was methodical. I documented everything. At 6:45 a.m. on a Tuesday, I photographed her leaving another notice on my door. On a Thursday afternoon, I used a telephoto lens to take pictures of her holding one of her official meetings on my dock. My trespassing tenants assembled before her. I recorded the times, the dates, the specific bylaw she was supposedly enforcing. George, my friendly neighbor, became an invaluable source of intel. He'd pass me copies of the meeting minutes and financial reports Brenda would distribute. Her financials were a joke. A handwritten ledger of dues collected and expenses paid. The biggest expense? Office supplies from a craft store, likely for her printer ink and laminating pouches. She was running a racket, plain and simple. She was using my other tenants' money to fund her hobby of harassing me. The most damning piece of evidence came from a deep dive into the state's corporate registry. As David suspected, there was no record of a Shady Lake Homeowners Association ever being registered as a nonprofit or any other kind of legal entity. It didn't exist. She was, in legal terms, committing fraud by collecting money under the name of a fictitious organization. The smoking gun. I compiled everything into a neat, organized portfolio. Photographs, a timeline of events, copies of her notices, George's insider documents, the state registry search results, and of course, a highlighted copy of her lease agreement. It was a thing of beauty, a perfect, logical, and inescapable case. The final piece of the puzzle was the delivery. I could just send an eviction notice through the property management company. It would be clean, simple, and anonymous. But where was the satisfaction in that? Where was the lesson? Brenda had built her entire identity around public authority and community rules. Her downfall, I decided, needed to be just as public. It needed to happen in front of the very people she had lorded her power over. I began drafting an invitation. Not an angry letter, but a polite, professional invitation sent to every resident. You are cordially invited to a community meeting, it read, to discuss the future of lake access and the establishment of a formal legal framework for dock maintenance. I scheduled it for a Thursday evening, 2 weeks out, right on my front lawn. I knew Brenda would see it as a sign of my surrender. She would assume I was finally coming to the table to negotiate my membership. She would walk right into it, binder in hand, ready for her final victory. She had no idea she wasn't coming to a negotiation. She was coming to her own eviction hearing. The evening of the meeting arrived. It was a warm, clear Thursday. I had set up a few folding chairs on my lawn, well away from the dock, creating a neutral space. At 7 p.m., people started to arrive. George came first, giving me a solid handshake and a knowing nod. Maria and her husband from the third house came next, looking nervous but hopeful. A few other neighbors from down the road, who had heard about the drama, showed up as well, drawn in by the promise of a resolution. And then, at 7:05 p.m., the guest of honor made her entrance. Brenda strode across her lawn like a conquering hero returning from battle. She was wearing a crisp blazer, holding her sacred binder to her chest, and had a triumphant smirk plastered on her face. She looked at me, at the assembled neighbors, and saw a crowd ready to bend the knee. She took her seat in the front row, the queen holding court. I let the small crowd settle, and then I stood up. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice calm and steady. "I know there's been a lot of confusion and disagreement lately regarding our lake access, and I wanted to clear the air once and for all." Brenda's smirk widened. This was it. Her moment. I let her think that for another 30 seconds. But before we talk about the future, I continued, we need to be perfectly clear about the present. I unrolled a large, professionally printed map, a brand new survey I'd had commissioned, and tacked it to an easel I'd set up. This is the official county-recorded plat map of our properties. I used a laser pointer to trace the lines. As you can see, this red line indicates the boundary of my property. The entire access path, the grassy area here, and the land the dock sits on are all unequivocally part of my private lot. They are not, and never have been, community property. A murmur went through the crowd. Maria's eyes went wide. Brenda's smirk faltered just a little. That's just your interpretation. She snapped, already on the defensive. The HOA provides stewardship of all communal assets. That brings me to my next point, I said, turning to face her directly. The HOA. I held up a single piece of paper. This is a certified letter from the Secretary of State's office, confirming that no entity by the name of the Shady Lake Homeowners Association is, or ever has been, legally registered in this state. Gasps, real, audible gasps. George was beaming. That means the organization you claim to be president of doesn't legally exist. The bylaws you've been enforcing have no legal authority. The dues and fines you've been collecting, well, that's a very interesting legal question, isn't it? Brenda shot to her feet, her face turning a blotchy red. This is slander. It's a community-run group. We don't need your government permission. But her voice lacked its usual conviction. The other 10s were now staring at her, a mixture of confusion and dawning anger on their faces. They were realizing they'd been paying for her power trip. And then I delivered the final, crushing blow. But you know, Brenda, all of this is actually secondary to the real issue. I picked up one last document from my folder. Her face was a mask of confusion. What else could there possibly be? We've been neighbors for a few years now, but I don't believe we've ever been properly introduced, I said, my voice dropping a little. My name is Frank Miller. I'm the sole proprietor of Miller Properties, LLC. I let that hang in the air for a moment. Complete silence. You could have heard a pin drop on the grass. I then held up the document for all to see. It was the first page of her lease. Her signature was clearly visible at the bottom. And according to this lease 2020, that makes me your landlord. Man, it was shocking. The absolute deafening silence was punctuated by a single, low, "Oh my God," from Maria. Brenda's face collapsed. The color drained from it, leaving behind a waxy, pale shell of her former arrogance. The binder slipped from her fingers and fell to the grass with a soft thud. Her little kingdom, her entire world of rules and regulations, had been built on a foundation of rented land. And the owner had just shown up to the party. I walked over and handed her 2 envelopes. This, I said, handing her the first one, is a formal cease and desist letter, demanding an immediate stop to all fraudulent HOA activities conducted on or directed from my rental property. And this, I said, handing her the second, much thicker envelope, is a 30-day notice of lease termination for cause. I listed the causes out loud for the benefit of the audience. Multiple violations of the quiet enjoyment clause through the continued harassment of a neighbor. That would be me. And operating an unregistered business from the premises. That would be your HOA. I stepped back. I believe this meeting is adjourned. There was no explosion. No final, defiant shout. Brenda just stood there, swaying slightly, the 2 envelopes clutched in her hand like they were toxic. She looked around at the faces of her former subjects, but there was no sympathy there. Only disillusionment and a dawning sense of betrayal. Without a word, she turned, picked up her now meaningless binder, and walked back into the blue house, closing the door behind her. It was the quietest, most brutal defeat I have ever witnessed. As soon as her door clicked shut, the tension broke. George let out a whoop and slapped me on the back. Maria and her husband came up, thanking me, apologizing for not speaking up sooner. The other neighbors were buzzing, recounting all the petty tyrannies they'd endured. A weight had been lifted from the entire community. In the weeks that followed, the aftermath was both sad and satisfying. Brenda moved out at the end of the 30 days, exactly at 5 p.m. on a Friday. No drama, no fight. The moving truck came and went, and just like that, the queen was gone. I felt a brief pang of something. Not pity, exactly, but a sadness for a person so consumed by a need for control that she lost everything. She had built her identity on a throne that didn't exist, and when it was kicked out from under her, there was nothing left. With her gone, a real sense of community began to form. I sat down with the other tenants and neighbors. We created a simple voluntary lake fund, a small contribution each year to a shared bank account, managed by a committee of 3, including George and Maria, to handle dock maintenance and path upkeep. It was transparent, it was legal, and it was friendly. Shady Lake finally became the peaceful sanctuary it was always meant to be. I get my quiet mornings on the dock now, uninterrupted. The loudest thing I hear is the splash of a fish jumping. Sometimes I think about Brenda. Karen. She must have been destined to have that name. I wonder if she ever learned her lesson. But mostly, I just feel a deep sense of satisfaction. I didn't set out to destroy someone just to protect my peace. But in the end, by using precision, patience, and the undeniable power of a well-documented fact, I didn't just win a fight. We liberated a whole neighborhood from a petty tyrant, all because she had the spectacular misfortune of trying to find her own landlord. I guess you could say her lease was, quite literally, up. Now that you've heard my crazy story, what do you think? What would you have done in my shoes? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories. You never know what kind of drama is brewing right next door.